So today let's start looking at a different type of storm called a hurricane. First of all, definition of what a hurricane is. A hurricane is a strong center of low pressure in the tropics that produces thunderstorms with winds greater than 73 miles per hour. Now that's pretty specific, but all those things are important. In other parts of the world, you have these same type of storms, but they're called some other names, typically called typhoons or cyclones. Now, the origin of the word hurricane is very unique in our language because most of our words in the English language come from European roots, Latin, Greek, English, German, but the word hurricane comes from the Mayan language, and the Mayans were a civilization in what is modern-day Mexico, and the reason why we have a name that comes from the Mayan language is because when the Europeans came over here, they had never seen these crazy types of storms. And they asked the Mayans, well, what do you call this? We've never seen something like this because you don't get hurricanes in Europe. And the Mayans had a name for these types of storms that kind of came around the same time every year, and they were called hurricane, named after a god or a deity that they associated with that violent type of weather event. So hence, hurricane is probably the only word in our language that comes from the Mayan language. And it's because there were no hurricanes in Europe, so there was no word for it. Now, hurricanes always form the same way. The first thing that has to happen is you have what's called a tropical wave. And this is just we get a low pressure off the west coast of Africa. And it gets blown across the equator from east to west by the trade winds. Well, as it moves across and the water gets warmer, it starts to evaporate more water, clouds start to grow, and you get a group of thunderstorms that come together. And they start pulling in more air, and you get winds of 23 to 39 miles an hour. That's what's called a tropical depression. Well, from there, if the storms get bigger and are allowed to grow and they get more organized, they start to spin together, and they become what's called a tropical storm, which have winds from 39 to 73 miles per hour. Now, in order for this process to happen, there are some very key ingredients that have to take place. First of all, remember, hurricanes are storms, which are clouds, which need water to evaporate in order to form. So warm water evaporates more than cold. So the first key ingredient in the step of hurricane formation is nice warm water that will evaporate easily. Otherwise, you won't get water in the air, you won't get clouds. Well, you also need low pressure, because if you had high pressure, it keeps the water down. So you got to have nice warm water. You got to have low pressure that allows it to evaporate and go up in the sky to form clouds. If you have high pressure, even if you have warm water, the high pressure is going to keep the water down and you're not going to get clouds forming. Well, even if the water goes up in the sky, you got warm water, evaporates, low pressure, if the winds up here are pretty strong, the winds are blowing this way, especially from the jet stream, the clouds aren't going to get a chance to form because the winds, those upper level winds, are going to blow the clouds apart before they have a chance to get organized. So the final ingredient that you need is low winds. So here's the perfect situation that's going to allow hurricanes to form. One, nice warm water that evaporates, ease it. Low pressure, which allows the water to go up in the air and form clouds. And finally, no upper level winds so the clouds can form and get organized. So there's a summary: warm water, low pressure, and calm upper level winds. So where do you have all these things? Where do all these things come together? In that area that we call the tropics. It's the area from 23.5 degrees north to 23.5 degrees south, because that's where the sun is always shining. It's going to be where it's warm enough for that nice hot warm water evaporating. Here's how hurricanes happen that affect the United States. They begin off the coast of Africa, low pressure system, which allows the water to evaporate. The trade winds blow that low pressure system to the west. And as they blow over that warm water, they pick up more water, clouds get bigger and more organized. Finally, once they get over here, then they've now got enough clouds, they've got enough storms, and they can kind of start to come together, and they get to that really warm water there near the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, and that allows them to grow into full-blown hurricanes. Now, hurricane season are between these dates, June 1st and November 30th. Well, why specifically those days? Why no January hurricanes? Because that's when the ocean water is warm enough that gives you enough evaporation to form the hurricanes. August and September are the most active months because that's when the water is hottest. After September, the water starts to cool down. Well, up until August, the water, remember, it takes a little while to get hot enough to really generate these storms. And you can see this distribution here on a chart that August and September, these months here in the middle, have the most hurricanes. Now, it's not impossible to get a hurricane in January. It's just not very likely. Well, where do hurricanes not form? Anywhere where the water is cold. So the more north you get, especially you go out of the tropics, the water's just not warm enough for a hurricane to form. This is also a reason why California doesn't get too many hurricanes, because we know the water of the Pacific near California is just too cold to have a hurricane form. Now, it's not impossible. This happened with Hurricane Norbert in September 2008. They got a hurricane over there off of Baja, California. And that's a little bit closer to the equator, but still it's kind of rare because that water out there is cold, not nearly as warm. So here's kind of a geographic breakdown of this. We don't get hurricanes forming up here. Water's too cold. Don't get too many Pacific hurricanes, at least on the U.S. side, because the water's too cold. Hurricanes happen here because that's where the water is warm. So how big are these things? In a word, they're big. A small hurricane would be 140 miles across, but they can be up to about the size of a state. Here you can see Hurricane Andrew in 1992. It is literally the size of the entire state of Florida. So hurricanes are big events. They're not small little single funnel clouds like a tornado that could impact one street and not the next street over. When a hurricane hits something, they impact a very large area. Now, how long do these things last? Most time, this is a long process. It takes a long time for the hurricane to soak up enough water. And hurricanes development is usually 1 to 2 weeks from when they start as a tropical storm to when they break apart. The world's longest lasting hurricane was 33 days. That's very rare. Now, how fast do they move? They're pretty slow, 10 to 20 miles per hour. So unlike thunderstorms and tornadoes, a hurricane's not going to sneak up on anyone. We know they're coming. We can see them develop. They take a couple weeks to get going, and they're not moving very fast. So hurricanes are a lot more better understood than tornadoes that just kind of pop up and you never know when and where. Now, most of the death and destruction from hurricane is not caused by the wind. Even though they are windy, it's caused by water. We have what's called the storm surge. As the wind is blowing this way, we know that wind causes waves. Well, hurricanes have a lot of wind with them, so the waves wind up being a lot bigger, and those waves then come on shore. Well, now we have this house over here, which was above the high water line, and now we get this big wall of water being pushed ashore by the hurricane, and that's what does the most damage. That's what kills people, not necessarily the wind. That is called the storm surge. The storm surge is the extra water that is pushed ashore by the hurricane winds. The stronger the winds, the larger the storm surge, because the more water gets pushed ashore, and it's especially bad if it occurs at high tide when the water level is already high. Now, here's a storm surge that came ashore. It was 18 feet high. So think almost 2 basketball goals stacked on top of each other. That's a really high amount of water. And that much water packs a lot of punch, and it will knock over stuff in its path. And you can see that's exactly what it did. All these houses that used to be in here, you can just see it looks like the land is scarred because the water knocked down almost everything in its path, except for that house at the bottom. And we're going to look at him and why he survived the storm. Now, the eye of a hurricane, you can see why the name comes from that little center of the hurricane. It looks like an eye. The eye is the calm center of the storm. And this is because all of the air is trying to rush towards that center of low pressure. But by the time the air gets it there, the center of the storm is not there anymore. So it kind of like has to swirl around to try to catch up to where the eye is. So that's why hurricanes have a very calm, center called the eye, where there aren't any clouds because the winds never get to that center point. The eye wall, however, is the area right around the edge of the eye, and that's where the winds are the most violent. Now, landfall, that's where the hurricane comes onto land, and that exact location is really, really important. The storm surge is always worse on this side of the eye. We're going to say the right side of the eye, because hurricanes are swirling like this. So on this side, you get a lot more water pushed ashore. On this side, you're actually getting kind of winds that are kind of blowing offshore, so it doesn't blow as much water onto the land. But to the right of the eye, here's my eye, anything on this side gets a lot more storm surge. So the storm surge is always more destructive, it's more damaging, it's worse on the right side of the eye when it makes landfall. This is a big deal. The last hurricane that hit Georgia, 1979, Savannah got it pretty bad. Brunswick did not, because you can see Brunswick down here, the winds were blowing this way, so it didn't push a lot of water onto the shore. Because the hurricane was swirling like this, on this side, there was a lot of water pushed out ahead of the hurricane. And Savannah got it really bad because they were on the right side of that eye. Now, here's the eye. Had the eye of the storm been just a few miles up here, Savannah wouldn't have had it very bad at all. So you want to know where the eye is going to make landfall, because that's going to tell you where the worst damage is going to be caused by the storm surge, because it's always worse immediately to the right of the eye. So what causes a hurricane to die? They don't last forever. Remember what they run on. Their fuel is warm water evaporating. So if you cut off the warm water supply, the hurricane's actually going to die. Well, what would cause that to happen? Well, factors. For one thing, if it moves over colder water, cold water doesn't evaporate and rise as much as warm water. So if a hurricane goes north, winds up over a cold water current, it's going to die because it's going to run out of gas because the water's not going to evaporate as quick. Landfall. Hurricanes always die once they hit land, because once it moves over land, evaporation stops because it has no water to suck up because it's now over land. So anytime a hurricane hits land, a significant size piece of land, like the main land, it's going to stop. Finally, wind shear. If the jet stream decides to suddenly change direction and the hurricane gets too close to the jet stream, the changing wind directions rip the clouds apart, and that disrupts the flow of air and the hurricane's ability to form clouds. Hurricane dies. So these are the three things that can cause a hurricane to break apart and die. So where do we get these hurricanes? In the United States, we're going to say that hurricanes primarily impact the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast. Now, hurricanes in the Gulf, we need a little bit of a special, pay a little bit of special attention to these. Here's what's special about hurricanes in the Gulf. If a hurricane comes in here, what do we know about the Gulf of Mexico? We know it's hot water. What do hurricanes love to run on? Hot water. So for hurricanes that get anywhere in this area here, the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, tend to become very powerful because they get over that extra hot water. So they kind of become supercharged. If a hurricane is heading this way and then it turns and goes up this direction, well, what do we know about the water up here? The water up here is cold. So the hurricane's just going to die, and it's not going to impact land. We remember from our wind unit that in this part of the country, your major winds blow like this. So it's very rare that a hurricane can ever take a turn and come back and hit the coast. Once it gets up here, it just kind of goes harmlessly out to sea and dies over the cold water. On the other hand, hurricanes that get in here cause big problems. Now, the Bermuda High. This is a big chunk of high pressure air hanging out in the Atlantic Ocean near the island of Bermuda, and it is very influential in determining where hurricanes go. This is a high pressure, and it is spinning like this. It's a chunk of air, high pressure spin this direction. So it's spinning around like this. And my hurricane might be floating along, coming this direction. And that high pressure can spin around and fling the hurricane that way. It can push it into the Gulf of Mexico, or it can push it north. Well, this is a good situation for us because hurricanes that go this direction, they move out over cold water, don't really hit land, and they just kind of die, don't really bother anybody, don't cause any damage or destruction. But if this Bermuda High is a little bit bigger or a little bit further south and does something like this, where it pushes a hurricane into the Gulf of Mexico, that's bad news. Why are hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico bad news? Two reasons. One, they get supercharged because they get a turbo boost from that extra hot water in there. Plus, once a hurricane gets in the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to hit land. The hurricanes that manage to go up this way just kind of go harmlessly out to sea and never hit land. But a hurricane that gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it's got no place to go. It's going to hit either Mexico, it's going to hit Texas, it's going to hit Louisiana, it's going to hit Florida. It's got no place to go. It is going to hit somebody. Now, rating and describing hurricanes, they're not all the same. Some are more powerful than others, just like tornadoes. And we categorize hurricanes by how strong they are. And this allows you to predict, well, how much damage can I expect from this storm versus another? How much do I have to be prepared for this one versus another? The system used to rate hurricanes is called the Saffir-Simpson scale. And it's a system rated on numbers 1 to 5, with 1 being the weakest hurricane and 5 being the strongest. Each higher number of hurricane has stronger winds and then hence a greater storm surge, because more winds is going to push more water onto shore. And remember, it's the water that's the problem with the hurricane, not necessarily the wind. Here's just kind of a visual, and we're not going to write all this down. It just gives you an idea. It shows you that a Category 5 has stronger winds than a Category 1. And you can see these descriptions. Category 1, minimal damage. Category 5, catastrophic damage. And you'll notice the difference in the storm surge. As the winds go higher, the storm surge gets bigger. So this is a way to just describe, hey, what can we expect from this hurricane? How damaging is it going to be? So that marks the end of the presentation. Bring the notes for a notes check and a done stamp.